for tonight's retrospective review, we're talking Back to the Future Part 3. And the way that the retrospectives typically work, we want to talk about how we first heard about the film back in the day, our initial impressions of it, or how we felt about it back then. And then we've rewatched the film recently. So we want to talk about how we feel about the film today in a more modern context. I'll start off here just real quick. I watched, I'm trying to remember how I was just reminiscing. I was trying to remember exactly how it was I first heard about Back to the Future Part 3. I'm pretty sure it was at the end of Back to the Future Part 2, because Back to the Future Part 2 pretty much ends with a teaser trailer for Back to the Future Part 3. I grew up as a kid actually watching and loving a lot of Westerns. I loved watching Lone Ranger growing up, and I was a big fan of actually the Bonanza show and also Big Valley. I loved all those shows. And I remember watching all kinds of Westerns with my mom, Support Your Local Sheriff, all those kind of fun things. I remember watching shows even like Paladin. So I'm a big fan of Westerns to begin with. And so I was very excited for this particular installment of Back to the Future Part 3. And then I remember we did see this one. I did see this in the movie theaters, and I just remember loving it. I don't remember having a lot of issues other than just loving it and feeling very fulfilled with how everything kind of ends. I felt like it ended on like a really good note. So that was how I first heard about it, and that was my initial impressions when I watched Back to the Future Part 3 when it originally came out. So tell me, Eric, how did you first hear about Back to the Future Part 3?
Well, as you mentioned, there's a trailer for what basically a highlight reel actually of Back to the Future Part 3 at the end of Back to the Future Part 2. In fact, I thought it was interesting that they included that with the version of the film that's on Netflix, and they did so because that is the theatrical version. When you went to the theaters, they basically had a commercial for Back to the Future 3 at the end of the movie. And I don't know if I can't think of any prominent movies off the top of my head that did that. The closest thing we might have right now is kind of what like the MCU does, where the MCU kind of has teasers, but the teasers they have are in universe. They're not specifically ads for the next movie. And Back to the Future Part 2 basically has an ad for Back to the Future Part 3 at the end of the movie, which I think is really kind of quirky and kind of fun and interesting in a way, because for me, it really, takes me back to that place in time. And so I absolutely knew about Back to the Future 3 because I saw I used to watch the credits and things like that as a kid. I used to like the score and the music. And so a lot of times I would hang out. Plus, I was always waiting to see Skeletor again come out of the sludge. And so, yeah, I saw the commercial there in the theater. And so I knew Back to the Future Part 3 was coming out. And so I was all ready to go and ended up seeing in the theater once again when Back to the Future 3 part came out.
Very cool. So what were your initial feelings about Back to the Future Part 3 when you originally saw it?
I remember liking it. I don't remember liking it as much as Back to the Future Part 2. I enjoyed it. I grew up watching Westerns, so I certainly had an affinity for Westerns, but it wasn't like Westerns were my favorite thing. Sci-fi was my favorite thing growing up. I always liked sci-fi. The sci-fi genre was always the coolest thing to me. Things like Star Trek and Star Wars, that was my bread and butter. And Back to the Future, at least initially, really fell into that, very well, very well. Back to the Future Part 3 is a little weird because it really is a Western. There are obviously some sci-fi elements in it, particularly obviously with the time travel and everything. But it really is a Western. And it's funny, I looked at some interviews and things like that from Michael J. Fox and from the creative team, and everybody basically said, yeah, we really wanted to make a Western. We wanted to make a Western, and so that's what we did. It is interesting also, by the way, there's a lot of foreshadowing in Back to the Future Part 2 related to Back to the Future Part 3, because the films were made back to back. There's a lot of backs. So because the films were made together at the same time and they knew exactly where the story was going, there's a lot of actual references. There's a lot of elements of Back to the Future Part 2 that are relevant for Back to the Future Part 3. And that was really interesting to kind of make those connections as I saw it in the theater, when I was much younger. And so I enjoyed it, although I thought it was a little, I guess I thought it was a little different. What did you think, Dave?
Well, like I said, I remember just thoroughly enjoying it when I saw it in theaters. I didn't I didn't have a lot of harsh opinions on it. I do remember that I felt like that I enjoyed it more than the second one. But I think again, like I said, like I like westerns and I like those kind of settings, so it kind of spoke to me, probably more than a different film might not have. It just wouldn't. I don't know. It's such a weird mixture of elements, but for me, it just really worked. I saw some people as I was reviewing information for this particular show tonight, and they talked about how that Back to the Future Part 3 is one of those, rare, really great steampunk movies, which is interesting because it that follows in line, to be a lot of elements of the film. But I don't know if I've ever thought of it in just exactly those kind of terms. And then just real quickly, because I forgot to do the summary and some other information real quick. So Back to the Future Part 3 came out in 1990. The summary is just real quickly. Stranded in 1955, Marty McFly learns about the death of Doc Brown in 1885 and must travel back in time to save him. With no fuel readily available for the DeLorean, the two must figure out how to escape the Old West before Emmett is murdered. Of course, this stars Michael J. Fox, Christopher Lloyd, Mary Steenburgen, she's new to the cast, Thomas F. Wilson, Leah Thompson, Elizabeth Shue, and such on and so forth, including a lot of really important, actually, Western actors known for a lot of their contributions, such as Matt Clark, Richard Dysart, Pat Buttram, and Harry Carey and Dub Taylor, to name just a few. Of course, James Tolkien also comes back, because James Tolkien is just one of those great character actors in a lot of things. This film, of course, was directed like the other ones by Robert Zemeckis. It was written by Robert Zemeckis and Bob Gale. Actually, it's quite a few. Yeah, Robert Zemeckis, Bob Gale. And of course, this score is also by Alan Silvestri, who did the last two films as well. And I think the score for this one is quite good. Like I said, I remember back in the day seeing it and just thoroughly enjoying the film. I don't remember having any kind of negative reaction about it at all. I thought it was neat because, well, let's go ahead and segue in how we feel about the film today, because I feel like I'm ready to talk about it in a broader context before I get too much further. Is there anything else you want to add, Eric, about any particular recollection or thoughts or feelings that you might have had about when you saw the film back in the day that you can think of?
No, not off the top of my head. Like I said, I did see it in the theater. I do remember enjoying it, but I also remember thinking it was a very different movie than the first two, which it is. It is a very different movie than the first two.
It is. It is a very different film, and that's one of the things I actually like about this one. So, we've talked about how we first heard about the film. We've talked about how we felt about the film when we saw it back in the day. So now we're going to talk about how we feel about the film today in a modern context, actually having recently revisited it. One of the things I really like about this film that I remember back in the day and also now is I do like the idea that we get to see Doc Brown be more the hero. He's not quite the sort of bumbling mad scientist that he is in the first two films. And that's actually very fun and kind of refreshing, because you see him being a little bit more confident, a little bit more sure at times of the things that he's doing. And I think it's because of the successes that he's had with his time machine. When we see him in the first film, he's so excited that the DeLorean actually works, that the time machine works. He's so excited he's inventing something that actually works, because you get the feeling that his life has been met with a lot of failure, as a scientist and as an inventor, trying to aspire to be one of those great men of science, that he's experienced a lot of failure and maybe doesn't have the confidence, that we see displayed in Back to the Future Part 3. And I think it's because of all the successes with the time travel and with the DeLorean, why he has quite the more heroic turn that he actually has in this film, which I thoroughly enjoyed. And so among the things I really like about this is I love that. I love a lot of the interesting callbacks that because we learned a lot more about Doc Brown in this film than we learned about some of the others. We learned that he loves Jules Verne. He talks a lot about that and 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. And it's just very interesting. And one of the things I remember back in the day, and then also today, reflecting upon it, is I remember back then thinking, it's like, wow, those stories were that old, that they were first published back during the days that there was, steam locomotives and people riding around on horses. Because I don't think of the films and those stories that, not the films, but the stories that inspired a lot of the films, like 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, which of course is a classic Disney film. I don't think of them as being that old, but man, those stories have been around for a long time. So how do I feel about the film today? I'd say the film is highly worth watching. I think it's definitely worth revisiting. If you haven't seen in a little while, it's actually Back to the Future Part 3 is actually celebrating an anniversary right now. So it's a good time actually to revisit Back to the Future Part 3. And so I say I'd highly recommend it. I think that would be it for me. I just said highly recommend it. So tell me, Eric, how do you feel about the film today?
Yeah, there's something really interesting that you said that I feel like I have to comment on right away. Otherwise, I'll lose the thought, because I kind of had it during the movie as well. There's an interesting scene because you were talking about the Jules Verne references, and that's of course the way that Doc Brown connects. It's Clara, right? That's her name. The name of the character,
yes,
the teacher.
Yes. Yeah.
Clara. Clara.
Right? Clara Clayton, because was it Clayton?
Clayton Ravine, where all the teachers are supposed to go die, which I do remember reacting to that as a kid. I do remember reacting to that idea that the kids were all making fun of, they all wanted their teachers to fall into the ravine.
Right.
But there's a really interesting thing about that, because you were talking about, in the one sense, it's like it's kind of strange to think that stuff was popular so long ago, but in a real way, it wasn't that long ago, and we kind of forget that this was still this was the beginning of the modern age. And there's a really interesting scene where Doc Brown is talking to Clara about the wonders of the future and talking about men blasting off into space. And she just kind of laughs at him, because you can tell Doc Brown is kind of like, I'm giving her like this great insight into the future. And she's all like, oh, I read that book, To the Moon. I read that book. I know exactly what you're talking about. So it's kind of funny. There's an idea in there that a well-educated person like herself, who's a school teacher, she totally understands this concept of being able to blast off and go to the moon. Because those concepts were already being put into people's minds at that time. And it makes you realize, in a way, how connected those people were with even how we are today, because so many of the modern trappings were already starting. Granted, they didn't have, automobiles and things like that, but they had trains. You know what I mean? And so that people were starting to think in those different directions. Their minds were starting to open up. And I just think that's kind of interesting. It was just something that I as you were talking, it just kind of made me go in the opposite direction a little bit about how sort of connected that time period is in a lot of ways to our own. And we just don't realize it. We just don't think in those terms because we think of it as being so foreign, but it's really not. It's nowhere near as foreign as, say, if you had gone to, the ancient Roman Empire or something like that, where you might have been burned as a heretic or something like that. They were pretty much getting beyond that point, in history. So Clara is able to understand Doc Brown in a lot of ways, and she's able to relate to him, even though he's talking about these crazy things. You know what I mean? Because to her, they're really not that crazy. She's kind of heard of them before, at least the concept.
And that's an interesting kind of observation. And it's definitely the opposite of what I was kind of thinking of. I wasn't thinking of it as being closer. I guess for my mind anyway, I think of it. I think of those days as being further off in the distance than they really sometimes, I guess, kind of are. Um, and I guess that's, I don't know. I guess that's sort of just my particular perspective on this. But the point you make is very interesting. Um, so, would you say that you would recommend people to revisit Back to the Future Part 3?
I would. I absolutely would recommend that people revisit Back to the Future Part 3. I do think it's very different than the other films. There's no doubt about that in my mind that it is different. And um, for some people, it might be a little, I don't know, a little bit jarring in a way. I mean, but the basic premise is still there, right? They're still traveling back in time. They're still going back and forth, that kind of a thing. They're trying to change the timeline. They've got that kind of strange version of time travel, I would say, that I think is, well, I shouldn't even, I guess, I'll just say that I think is impossible, but I prefer sort of the MCU version of time travel. I think that makes more sense. But it's still fun. It's still fun. It's still within the context of the other films. It's just a little bit different. That's all I would say is that Back to the Future Part 3 is a little bit different than the other films, obviously because of the genre, because it is a Western film, and I think should be regarded that way. And I think it's interesting that you brought up the idea of it being a steampunk film because I never really thought of it that way. But certainly you could make that argument that this is probably one of the most successful steampunk films ever made. I think you could make that argument, especially with the way that Doc Brown is back in the past. He definitely is very steampunk, and he actually the ending he's shown to be the ultimate steampunk. So there's definitely that argument to be made that this is a steampunk film.
Yeah, it's just an interesting connection. I'd read someone else had kind of made that comment, and I was like, oh, that's interesting. I hadn't really thought of it in that context, but it does kind of ring true. We do have a couple comments here real quick. James Stone says from the Rogues Gallery says, as an 11-year-old, I was more interested in hoverboards than horses, but part 3 was fun. And then Bobby Chambers says, did you see the Doc's son giving the finger on the last scene? I wonder if that's cut out of the Netflix version.
I never noticed that. That's another one I've never noticed.
Yeah,
I had no idea he was doing that.
That's hilarious.
I've never noticed that. I'll have to go back and watch, and that's pretty funny to say if that was censored. And who knows? Maybe we'll make some news here. We'll find out that it was censored. They doctored part 3 too.
Wow,
those bastards. No, I didn't know that. I did not know that the Doc's son is giving the finger in the theatrical version. And he said, "Yep, go back." He said he flips the bird.
I remember he's kind of fidgety. I do remember that he was kind of fidgety, but I don't remember that he specifically flipped the bird. But I'll have to look into it now, just out of curiosity, just to see.
I remember even as a kid, though. I thought that the Doc Brown's kids were just like so wooden, and I was all like, why don't they have like any personality like at all? You know what I mean? And granted, it was just show them off and then put them away. Oh, James Stone says he was deaf and he signaled he had to use the bathroom.
Wow.
And maybe that's why I have that. That's why I had that thought of them being kind of wooden. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
That's interesting. Wow, that's really interesting. I didn't know that. I had no idea. I didn't know about either one of those things.
Wow, crazy. Interesting. Huh. Well, there you go. Learn something new. Bobby Chambers comments. He says, "Well, that kills the humor of it." Unfortunately, Bobby, it does.
That's what knowledge does sometimes. Knowledge does sometimes.
Here's a cold glass of water to pour on our fun. Right there. There you go. There you go, everybody. No, I'm just kidding. Well, that's interesting. I'll have to rewatch that last part again now because now I'm curious.
I'm going to look up the signing for I need to go to the bathroom so I can
Wow.
confirm what James
Funny.
is saying.
And then James is saying that it's actually on the Blu-ray commentary. He believes. So wow, learn something new every day. I'll be honest, the Back to the Future films were the one of those. I have it on Blu-ray for this show. I actually watched it on Netflix, actually for our reviewing purposes here. But I don't think I've ever delved too far into the special features on the Back to the Future Blu-rays. I just don't think I have. I think it's because I watched that back in time. The Back to the Future documentary, and probably felt like, it's probably got it covered. But I should have known better because, for example, like if you're a fan of Alien or Aliens, and you watch Memory, Memory is this really current, recent documentary, talking about Alien and Aliens and the impact that the films had, on films and culture and such on and so forth. But that Memory film, what's kind of interesting, it's very surface and doesn't have anywhere near the depth of the content or the interesting commentary on making the film, as well as the film, sort of in its legacy state. As if you actually watch, they had this Alien Quadrilogy where they took the 5 Alien films or whatever, and they smashed them in this one giant DVD box set. That has some of the most amazing stuff. Like when you go through and you look at and watch some of those documentaries where they talk about the creation of the various Alien films, it's so terribly interesting, and they get into all kinds of nuance. The craziest one, of course, is Alien 3 and what happened with that film. But I think I just assumed because I'd watched the Back in Time documentary, I thought it was probably good. So I haven't spent as much time actually looking at the special features and listening to the director's commentaries on Back to the Future that's on the Blu-rays. But since you brought it up, James, I begin to realize that was probably short-sighted of me, and I should actually revisit those films and actually watch them, in the Blu-ray format, maybe with the commentary on, and see what other interesting things I can learn. Thanks for pointing that out. I had no idea.
Well, along those lines, because I mentioned it earlier about the fact that there are scenes that are omitted from this version of the film that are on the DVD special edition, and I never owned it. My roommate did, and I watched all of the DVD, the deleted scenes with the commentary on. And one of the scenes that's most interesting, and it really would have just, I think, killed the film if they'd kept it in, but it totally explained what was going on. If anybody remembers, obviously the marshal, who's played by the same actor who played the school principal or the dean of students, he plays the town marshal, and the town marshal is nowhere to be found when Marty has his confrontation with Mad Dog. In fact, when Mad Dog is finally brought to justice, it's by his deputy and a posse. Now, the reason for that, and this is something, it's not technically a spoiler because it was taken out of the movie. It's just one of these weird things about the movie. Well, what happened was, or what was supposed to happen is, Mad Dog murdered the marshal in front of his son. Because if you remember in the movie, he actually is sitting there with his son and talking to him about discipline and the fact that you can't give these guys an inch. That's when he disarms Mad Dog and his crew. So obviously the marshal's competent and he keeps an eye on Mad Dog. But he's actually shot in the back and murdered by Mad Dog Tannen in this deleted scene. And it totally explained why the marshal wasn't there and why the marshal didn't intervene in the gunfight. But it was just like this incredibly depressing scene of seeing this man murdered in front of his son, which of course happened in the Old West. That's that kind of stuff actually happened. And they took it out. But it's pretty interesting when you talk about that extra content. If you haven't seen it, it's just a crazy scene. And I'm like, oh, I totally understand. I totally understand why they shot this. And then I totally understand why they took it out,
Wow, that's that to me is kind of crazy. I had again, like I said, I'd never spent a lot of time diving into the Back to the Future features that are available on the Blu-rays. That's crazy to me. And of course, that actor, that's actually James Tolkien. James Tolkien was a great character actor. The films I think of him most for, besides Back to the Future films, I think of him because he's actually the police officer that's actually trailing He-Man, Teela, and Gwildor in the Master Universe film. But he is also, I can't remember if I think he's the first. He's the first. I think he's the first. When you watch Top Gun, I think he is actually Maverick's commanding officer at the beginning of the film. He's the one that basically tells him, it's like, you've got I can't believe I'm going to do this. You got your dream shot. You're going to go up against the best at Top Gun. I believe James Tolkien plays that role as well. He's one of those great character actors. You would have seen him in more things over the years, and I have this horrifying feeling that maybe there's a reason that we haven't seen him doing more over the years, but or maybe it's just because those initial roles are so memorable. No, yeah, James Tolkien's really awesome too. But I don't know if I would have enjoyed watching him get shot in the back, because like I said, I kind of liked this character, even though he was a bit of a funny.
Well, it's a crazy scene to watch. It's just like, wow. This was supposed to be in a comedy, but it was meant for the narrative to explain why the marshal isn't there and why he doesn't intervene. Obviously, he was killed. That was the idea. But I remember that on the commentary, the director even said, it's like, after we did this, we realized, like, we have to kill Mad Dog. Like, we can't let him live. And of course, Mad Dog can't die because he has descendants and stuff like that. So it's like, all right, we need to get rid of this scene and we need to redo this. And then if you recall, when the posse comes in, it's actually, they say something about a robbery that Mad Dog did instead of saying they're coming to get him for killing the marshal, because that's the original idea would have been that the posse comes in because Mad Dog murdered the marshal, So yeah, it's crazy. It's crazy, crazy, crazy.
Well, very, very cool. I had no idea. I'm gonna have to dive into some of these features on the Back to the Future discs, and apparently I've missed a ton of interesting things that are worth exploring on them. Very cool, very cool.